Hello, my name is Kris Nelson. My site is evolveconsciousness.org, and I will be presenting the Law of Freedom Part 3, Deeper with Definitions. And the purpose of this presentation in Part 3 is to go deeper with definitions about terms and concepts that underlie the understanding of the Law of Freedom. So I've already went into the understanding of law. Now we're going to go more into freedom and the aspect of the law of freedom that produces freedom, which is morality, and the corollary, which is immorality, and the opposite of freedom, which is slavery. So defining those, and if you're interested in more of those definitions, I have the presentation series on natural law, the science of morality, part 1 on rights, part 2 slavery, part 3 true freedom, part 4 morality. So those go even more in depth, but this will just be providing a summary of all those definitions to have a better understanding, and some additional aspects of some definitions like consequences and something I refer to as the principle of quantity. A right is an action that doesn't inherently initiate harm to another sentient being. Initiating harm, a wrong, is theft of rightful property. Property is based in ownership. The default ownership of a sentient being is their body and their will, which is self-ownership. Other rightful property is acquired by mixing labor with natural resources, which is known as original appropriation, or the other way to obtain property is with voluntary exchanges. There are 7 primary property violations, these are the wrongs, which are thefts of types of property. So the 7 property violations or thefts are murder, the theft of life; rape, the theft of sexual association; assault, the theft of bodily integrity, or you could say bodily well-being, but it's more the physical well-being, not taking into account how your body, your physical well-being feels in terms of emotions. So it's not because you have a psychological or emotionally distraught and you feel it physically in your body as a physiological thing. It's really the physical integrity. That's why I call it the bodily integrity of your body. Coercion or duress is the theft of free will choice or consent or your autonomy. Standard theft is the theft of standard property, things you own, like a pencil, or you made a house, or you made something, or you bought something. Trespass is the theft of the security of your living domain, and willful deception, which is fraud, is the theft of the ability to make informed decisions. So I've gone into this more in depth in, as I mentioned, natural law, the science of freedom, part 1, rights, and part 4 on morality. So you can take a look at that. I think more in depth in part 1 on rights. Slavery defined. Slavery is a false claim of ownership, theft, on another's rightful property. A society of slavery is when there is an accepted, widespread, and persistent or repeating claim of ownership on others' property. Immoral behavior, theft, is a false claim of ownership, abbreviated as FCO, and de facto enslavement, taking property from someone who initiated no harm, non-violent, the person's being non-violent, is taking their freedom, which is creating slavery. Making non-violent people do or not do things by threat of violence is coercion, which is a false claim of ownership. So that's what the wrongs, here the property violations and thefts, another way of looking at it is it's a false claim of ownership because you're claiming to own something. You're making a claim upon someone else's property that you don't own. Hence it's a false claim of ownership, and that's theft. And that's why they're called thefts. So there's a lot of interrelated terminology and definitions that You can use different words to mean the same thing. A society that views some people, which would be authorities, as having the, quote, moral right to issue commands that others have a, quote, moral obligation to obey under penalty of violence, again, that's a false claim of ownership, is a society of slavery where some are masters who have authority over others who are slaves. And hint, hint, hope you realize that that's the society we live in, is the authorities. People believe that they have a moral right to issue commands, and that's the legal system, the fake laws, not the true law, like a true law of the universe. And everyone else is morally obliged to obey. Otherwise, if you don't obey their false claim of ownership, their initial false claim of ownership, they're going to increase the severity of violence and the severity of making false claims of ownership upon you in higher degrees of property violations. So that's where you're a slave, because people are making false claims of ownership, and then that's persisting. So it's in perpetuity, it's duress. So it's coercion in perpetuity, where they're saying you have to do something, and if you don't, well, I'm going to hurt you more. I'm going to take something more from you. Slavery has to be created. It's not the default condition of a being. True freedom is the default and gets degraded by immoral behavior. True freedom defined. True freedom is the absence of persistent or repeating false claims of ownership, that is to say, slavery, in the aggregate, with the respect of everyone's natural rights and their defense when not respected. Preserving and restoring freedom comes from free will. Free will has consent. Violating someone's consent for what they allow to be done with their rightful property is taking that property and freedom away from them. That is theft. And creating a temporary or persistent condition of the opposite of freedom, slavery. A temporary theft is an injustice that temporarily degrades true freedom, while persistent conditions of theft create the condition of persistent slavery. So you could look, you might make the correlation of, when someone's making a false claim of ownership, theft, violence, they're creating an injustice, and as long as an injustice is there, then true freedom isn't there. But that's not the case, because something could be done at an instance. Imagine a world where someone robbed someone, and that's the only thing that happened for the next 10 years. And other than that, there was no immorality occurring. Well, true freedom would still be there. At the time that it happened, true freedom would not have been there. But when it happened, true freedom was degraded because that act, the false claim of ownership, was there, but it wasn't persisted, so it was an instance. And when it's repeated over and over and it keeps happening, well, that means your condition is where you have false claims of ownership repeated, and that's the coercion we live under threat of greater violence if we don't comply with the commands of our would-be rulers and masters. So when it's persisted, then you have slavery. And that's when true freedom is degraded and gone permanently. And if it's not repeated, then it's just an instance where true freedom goes down and then it comes back up. Everyone has the right to unimpeded use of their rightful property and to live by voluntary or consensual interactions with others. Those who initiate harm, or committing a theft, an act of theft, abandon their right to consent to harm and can have negative consequences applied. Morality defined. Morality consists of objectively defined rules of right and wrong behavior. Basic moral behaviors, I refer to as M1, are a right because they don't initiate harm. And that is a theft. You don't have a right to do primary immoral behaviors, as I refer to that as I1, because they initiate harm, which is a false claim of ownership and an act of enslavement, and that is creating evil. So the basic morality is M1, you don't initiate harm. If you do initiate harm, that's something you don't have a right to do, and that's primary immoral behavior. That's I1. If you want others to initiate harm, even though you're not doing it yourself, then you're also primarily immoral. That is I1. If you don't tolerate the persistent evil, if you tolerate the persistent evil, which is also persistent enslavement, by doing nothing to try to reverse it, then you're letting evil be. You're letting evil run amok, which isn't creating evil itself, that action of letting it happen, not doing anything to try to reduce it, reverse it. So it's not a primary immorality, but it is a secondary immorality, which is I2, as I refer to it. The work to reverse conditions of enslavement and bring back true freedom is the great work, and is accomplished through moral education. And this is higher morality, and I refer to that as M2. Respecting the rights of others, the non-aggression principle. You respect the rights of others, the non-aggression principle, otherwise you engage in wrongful harm, which is theft, and others have the right to defend themselves against your violations of their rights, which will result in rightful harm to you. And that's the self-defense principle. Physical defense against evil is also a higher morality, M2. So there's two pathways to the higher morality. One is through moral education, the great work, and the other one is self-defense principle against evil. So they both work against evil to reverse evil or to bring justice to an injustice. Morality and slavery. Being moral is to interact with the property of others with their consent. Being immoral is to interact with the property of others without their consent. There is no implied consent, as though you can do anything with another's property by default, unless they explicitly say you can't. So you might have the idea, it's been said that the manipulators, the controllers, dark occultists, the evil ones, the hidden hand, whatever, they're being immoral, they're doing immoral things, and some may view that as, they're allowed to do it because we're not saying no. That's just their perception of it. It doesn't matter if you don't say no. If it's someone else's property, it's not automatically that you can do anything you want with their property unless they explicitly say no. That's not how it works. The default is, no, you can't do anything you want with another person's property, another being's property. By default. The default is you can't. And to do something, you have to gain consent. They have to agree to it. Being moral is to not treat others like your slaves by going against the consent of interacting with their property. Slavery happens when others don't get to choose what someone else can do with their property. Your will supersedes or overrides their will. Slavery is where you act as a master over others. You decide for them without their non-coerced consent. You act as if you own them in some way. When you use property without consent, you are stealing. You are deciding for them, as if you own them and expect them to just take it. It's making a false claim of ownership. Slavery and freedom. Slavery is the opposite of freedom. Creating a false claim of ownership, be it temporary or persistent, is creating slavery. An instance of a false claim of ownership is an instance of enslavement. A repeated or persistent false claim of ownership creates persistent slavery as a permanent condition of life. Behavior makes the false claim of ownership. No one has to verbally state, I own you, for a false claim of ownership to be made. The state of true freedom is present when there is no false claim of ownership. The state of true freedom is absent when there is any false claim of ownership. If the false claim of ownership is persistent, true freedom doesn't return until the false claim of ownership stops persisting. If the false claim of ownership is a temporary instance, then true freedom degrades temporarily but returns despite an injustice not having been rectified. Not having true freedom, while still having some freedoms, is a degradation of true freedom and is slavery. For example, duress is persistent slavery, persistent injustice, and the permanent loss of true freedom while that condition persists. A mugging is temporary enslavement, an injustice to be rectified, but with true freedom not persistently degraded. So I hope that's clear that there's some false claims of ownership that are temporary. They happen once, they're one and done. And so true freedom, a long time, true freedom goes down at that instance, and then it goes back up because that instance didn't repeat. But we live in a society where duress, the perpetual, persistent, in perpetuity coercion of do this thing that I don't have a right to make you do or to make you not do, to prevent you from doing something. And if you don't do what I say or don't not do what I say you're not allowed to do, then I'm going to hurt you more. I'm going to initiate harm at a greater degree. So do this, pay taxes, or else I'm going to kidnap you and put you in jail. Pay taxes, or I'm going to apply a fine before I kidnap you and put you in jail. Don't ingest this substance, or else I'm going to give you a fine. If you don't pay the fine, then I'm going to kidnap you and put you in jail. And if you try to defend yourself against my aggression, my violence, my false claim of ownership upon you, then I'll execute you. And that's the way agents of the state operate. That's what every employee of authority of the government, which is a representation of authority, and prior to government there were monarchies or there was religion, and they commanded things and applied punishments to people for not obeying them. And they were always false claims of ownership. When the person was not initiating harm, they had a right to do what they were doing. Consequence. From Old French, consequence, result. And modern French, conséquence, Latin consequentia. And it's from the stem of consequi, to follow after. So we have to follow after, something that falls after, something that's a result. So the common understanding of consequence is of a negative result to a person who created an undesirable behavior, often a negative, immoral behavior. But consequence is any result. Consequence is an effect which follows a cause. Behavior can have positive or negative results, which may or may not affect others. The results that affect others can, in turn, through reciprocity, have others create behavior, which can have positive or negative results upon the originator of the first behavior. This process can repeat, and in flawed ways when there is a failure to understand objective morality. For example, people creating immoral consequences, which is the government violence, take your pick, in response to others who create moral consequences, such as righteous self-defense, to those who initiate harm, which are violators of natural rights. So this is how it can repeat. You can have this chain of consequences applying, in this case, it's negative results, and it's applied in a flawed way because it's a failure to understand objective morality. So people think the government has a right to do it against people who are not violating morality, who are not violating the natural rights of others. And those would be the people who create moral consequences, for instance. And so people in society view those people as being violent when they're applying consequences to those who actually initiate harm. So things are backwards in society because people don't have the knowledge of objective morality. So this application of consequences as any result, something that follows after, is being corrupted. And I'll talk about consequences more in subsequent parts of the presentation on the law of freedom that have to do with karma and getting into that. And I've already talked about it a bit, I think in the previous one, part 2, when I was talking about you have a desire, then you make a choice, and well, what's the consequence from that choice? And did you get what you wanted? Freedom and unity is based in morality. So this is just a chart representation of the law of freedom, what we do and what we get. Well, you're going to live in morality, truth, united with moral truth. Well, then what you're going to get is unity with other people. You're going to get freedom. You're going to get peace. So right actions lift you up. Conversely, wrong actions weigh you down because you're in immorality and falsity. You're divided from moral truth. You're in division with the moral truth and with others. If you're in immorality, you're going to create slavery. And instead of peace, you end up at war, with conflict. True freedom or freedoms. So this is clarifying how people view freedom in terms of freedoms that apply to them. They're free to do this, they're free to do that. So people think that in whatever country they're in, that they're free. I am free. Yes, you are actually free in nature. You're actually a sovereign being. But the condition you live in isn't freedom. People believe that the condition they live in is freedom, but it isn't. So most people think that way. They live in a free country, but they don't. They have more or less freedoms, but that's comparable to true freedom in a society, and we don't have true freedom. So on the left, there's no freedoms, and on the right, there's true freedoms. And in between, you can go towards the left, which is having less freedoms, or you can go towards the right, which is having more freedoms. So these are the amount of freedoms that are allowed by authorities, because they're the ones taking it away in our society as we have it. And this is our enslavement degree. And the more you go towards the left, the more overt and in your face it gets. So right now we have more covert, so it's not obvious and people don't see it. And the non-aggression principle, the self-defense principle, is restricted or violated when you're living anywhere that's not on the right side in true freedom. Well, that means you're living in restrictions and violations, because you have more freedoms relative to less freedoms, but you don't have true freedom. So this is where we have tolerated wrongs, normalized and persistent slavery and injustice that is unrectified. You have freedoms, but not having true freedom. So true freedom is where, instead of having your non-aggression principle restricted and violated, or the self-defense principle restricted and violated, it's upheld. Untolerated wrongs, no persistent slavery or injustice. The injustice is remediated. So what we're living in is we have licensure, prohibition, and taxation. So that's an example of how we have less freedoms than true freedom. And it gets worse, right? From that point, you could go to increasing the physical severity. So going from more covert of licensure, prohibition, taxation, to the more overt forms of the loss of freedoms, which is the increase of slavery, and that's going to ball and chain slavery, the chattel slavery. It's in your face, and what most people only view as slavery. And if it's not that type of slavery, then they don't consider it slavery. We can check out Natural Law, the Science of Morality, Part 2, Slavery, where I go into that more in depth. Because if someone is taking any percent of the fruits of your labor, whether it's 100% or 99% or 1%, that's still making a claim of ownership, a false claim of ownership upon your property, and therefore upon you and your body and what you produce with your body, and therefore upon you. True freedom as an absolute value. So we're going to talk about true freedom, looking at it as an absolute. And that's what I've already been talking about, is it's an absolute, right? On the previous chart on the right, well, it's absolute. And if you have a degradation of that absolute, then you don't have true freedom. Each individual in an area makes up that grouping. If you have a metric of health or illness of a group of people, that means you have to measure how many people are healthy or ill. Then you can say how much of a majority or quantity are healthy or ill. If there is one individual who is ill, then the group isn't fully healthy. If everyone is healthy, then the group is healthy. The same goes with the law of freedom. There is the metric of how much freedom each person has, and added up is how much freedom there is in total in the group. If everyone has all their freedoms, so all your natural rights respected, that means you're truly free, then the group is truly free, and that is the condition of true freedom. When one person loses a freedom and is no longer truly free, they don't have all their freedoms. This happens as a result of another person being immoral towards them. As more people are immoral, they are removing more freedoms from others, and the aggregate state of freedom degrades more. Hence, the formula that Mark Passio came up with, which is the aggregate freedom is directly proportional to aggregate morality. And you go back to my part 1 in the law of freedom, where I go into that more in depth. And this is talking about persistent immorality. So persistent loss of freedom. So you can no longer be truly free at one instance, but then after that instance of a violation, the injustice might still be there and it hasn't been rectified. But you're free again after that. So we'll get into that later in injustice and a debt to be repaid. Well, we won't talk about that right now. True freedom as an absolute value. The sum of freedom is proportional to the sum of moral behavior, and immoral behavior reduces the maximum amount or quantity of freedom. So here's an equation I made. So TF is true freedom, and that equals absolute freedom, which is directly proportional to absolute the morality of each individual. So it's another way of looking at the law of freedom in terms of looking at it as absolute freedom, because true freedom is an absolute. So I'm just using those, the 2 bars. That's the symbol for an absolute value. An absolute value is a value that's not in the negative. So true freedom is when there's not a degradation of true freedom. When freedom is an absolute, it means it's not reduced. And that's because morality is at an absolute, meaning it's not reduced, which would mean there's immoral behavior. That's what would mean the morality is not an absolute value. The absolute it can be. There would be a negative in that behavior because you'd be being immoral. So it wouldn't be positive, it'd be negative. And freedom as well, since it's correlated to morality, then it would not be an absolute freedom, and then therefore you don't have true freedom, because true freedom is only possible, it only equals true freedom when you have the absolute of freedom. It's only in the positive, and the behavior is only in the positive in terms of morality. Therefore, true freedom is all freedom and contains no non-freedom, which is absolute freedom, meaning no slavery. If you have some slavery, then it's not absolute freedom because there's some non-freedom. This is proportional to all individuals having no non-moral behaviors. Absolute morality, meaning no immoral behavior. If immoral behavior is introduced and repeats, so hence repeats, it's important, it has to be repeated and persistent, then freedom is degraded. Absolute freedom is no longer present. True freedom is no longer present. Then the defense principle needs to be employed to enact justice and to restore and maintain true freedom. Moral unity is required for people to love their neighbor as themselves, to be their brother's keeper, and reciprocate involvement in restoring justice for injustices to anyone and everyone. Otherwise, you stand alone against violators, and the restoration of justice is more difficult or impossible in some cases, and true freedom is never restored. True freedom depends on moral unity between individuals upholding justice. True freedom is collective. As long as there are two or more higher order consciousnesses, then true freedom is collective. And by collective, it means by all and for all. Higher order consciousnesses are those that have the capacity to understand objective morality, to choose between moral and immoral behavior, and to communicate the goal to reach true freedom via moral behavior. So I went into these points in the previous part 2 of the Law of Freedom. You can check that out. True freedom is maintained or restored by all, for all, ideally via justice for all, by all, or at least by a significant quantity to make it happen. Without applying justice through the sacred masculine defense principle, when injustice is repeated, true freedom is lost. Losing true freedom permanently requires others who can keep it away through persistent initiation of harm, which is violence and injustice. But it's always possible to find true freedom again by restoring it, which is to put a stop to the repetition of violence. And so long as the violence repeats, so long as the immorality repeats, and that keeps the condition of slavery as a permanent condition, then true freedom is gone. So it takes people applying defense, either for themselves or for others, together in unison, united with morality, to bring it back. True freedom together. True freedom only happens together. That's why it's collective. Freedom for you alone isn't true freedom. If you ignore the violations done to others, you invite the ignorance of others when violations are done to you. That means they're going to ignore you. If you ignore what happens to other people that's wrong, well then why would they pay attention when wrongs are done to you? You jeopardize your own freedom. And that's what we're doing as a society through our cowardice. Individuals are not united with morality in themselves, and we are not collectively united in the aggregate, and at least a significant portion of us, a significant quantity, a majority. We're not united together through morality as true beings, truly moral beings united together. So we jeopardize our own freedom because we're all not standing together, united against injustice, united against wrongs and immorality. So when the violation persists, you won't have freedom in the future until it stops repeating. And that's what we have. We have the persistent, repeating violations, and they're not stopping because we're not making them stop. Because we're not morally united, because as individuals, we are not united with morality. Too few of us are. Stopping persistent slavery is easier with others, and it's often necessary. So if something happens to you, one individual does something wrong to you, creates an injustice towards you, you can deal with it on your own in some cases. And it's always easier if you have more people with you, united with you, to deal with that one person. But when it's a lot of people, like hundreds or thousands or millions, then you alone, well, you're not going to be able to deal with it. So that's when it's necessary that you need to be with others to do it, to make it happen. You can be completely free at one moment, and the next someone is violating your rights. Do you want to be all alone to defend yourself or seek justice? I'm not saying, can you not defend yourself? I'm saying, do you want to be all by yourself to try to, in a situation where something happens? You can be, and you can defend yourself and learn how. But do you want that, or would you rather be with a bunch of other people? Well, obviously we'd want to have a bunch of other people backing us up. The same with justice. To seek justice, well, you'd want other people to support you. So good luck against multiple violators. If you think you're just gonna do that alone all the time, to defend yourself alone, or to seek justice alone, when there's multiple violators, which is what we live in. Who's going to help you if you won't help them? No one. True freedom depends on unity with morality as an individual, that is to say, being a moral individual and being united with other moral individuals. Unite for cooperative defense and justice, or be alone to deal with violators. So long as one is persistently enslaved, suffering, we are all suffering, denied true freedom. We are all denied true freedom if one is persistently enslaved and denied their freedoms. True freedom for all, or true freedom for none. And you can take a look at Natural Law, the Science of Morality, Part 3, True Freedom. I go more in depth on that aspect. Individual and collective, or aggregate. So this is to clear up people's misunderstandings of the importance of the collective or the group or society versus the individual. So the collective or aggregate we never supersedes the rights of an individual. Any subversion of individual rights by other individuals claiming the superiority of a group invalidates the integrity of their group. The group or collective is never superior to individual rights. So if individuals are claiming that their group is superior and they're subverting individual rights, well, it negates the moral integrity of their group, and the group is, we can say it's worthless on moral grounds. An individual tree or human exists. You can pick an individual anything. I'm using a tree because we have a grouping, order, construct, abstraction called a forest, that we refer to it just like humans in society. So I'm just using tree and human as examples to demonstrate this. The collective, like a society or a forest, refers to grouping of individuals, individual humans, individual trees. The abstraction of a forest or society is predicated upon the existence of primary substances, and those primary substances are trees or human individuals, and doesn't exist as a group without it. The forest or society is secondary. Individuals are sovereign. Any group or collective that doesn't respect individual sovereignty, like society, that collective or group known as society, isn't a moral we. They're not a moral society, nor are they a true unity in true cooperation. So if you want true cooperation and true unity, you got to go through morality. Otherwise, you have bullshit unity, bullshit cooperation. It's a master-slave collection. So it's a collective of an aggregate of master-slave relationships, not a collection of individuals respecting each other's sovereignty and rights. You're expected to subsume yourself to the superiority of the collective we, represented by authority that perpetuates the master-slave relationship and violates your sovereignty. Here's something I call the principle of quantity, or the principle of the majority. So it's a numbers game. The aggregate reflects the majority. Whatever there is the most of is what the condition reflects. Add 2 drops of red paint to a blue bucket, and it's still mostly blue. Mix 1,000 buckets of red paint with 1 blue bucket, and you still have mostly red. So you can see this, how the red and the blue, well, it's mostly blue, but it's not, as I write at the bottom, the law of freedom is not all freedom equals not true freedom. So that's what I was talking about earlier, about the absolute. It has to be absolute freedom. There can't be any negative away from it. There can't be any slavery. There can't be any violations. It has to be absolute morality. And if there's immorality, then you don't have absolute freedom. You don't have true freedom. This operates by the law of freedom. Because if something is not all blue, well, then it's not pure blue. It's not true blue. It's been diluted from that true blue sense. And if the same thing with the red side, it's not purely red if you have some blue mixed in. And if you mix them both, well, you don't have mostly blue or mostly red, you have purple. So that's in the small circles. You can see how if you mix a bunch of red dots and some blue dots, well, you're going to get purple dots. You don't see it in the big picture as much because you see the big dots, but when you shrink it small enough, you can see how it turns into purple. And that's what happens when you mix red and blue paint. You get purple. The law of freedom. This is representing it as a chart again with a bit more description to it. So in the chart, we have aggregate slavery, societal, and we have aggregate immorality. And the goal is that 0 point, freedom and morality, to have no immorality, which doesn't create any aggregate slavery. So the aggregate quantity creating or supporting immorality, so that's the amount of people, that diagonal bar is the amount of people that are creating or supporting immorality, and that level is maintained by tolerance, and the level increases with more immorality tolerated. So this is where we are, right? So much immorality is being accepted and normalized in society. Things can and will get worse if we let it. So the work of teaching morality is required to get true freedom. So that goal is when no immorality is tolerated, no slavery persists, we have true freedom and true order. An immoral society is attached to that condition as natural, the condition being immorality, which is producing slavery. So that condition that they produce, that immoral society, they're attached to that condition of the immoral society as natural, normal, and necessary, and fights to preserve that false, conditioned way of life. You can think of the best movie ever made, The Matrix, when Morpheus brings Neo into the first construct simulation, the training program, as he refers to it. He's talking about how people are so inured by the system, by the matrix, that they fight to protect it. That's exactly what that is. Teaching objective morality frees minds to reverse the condition of accepting the condition of slavery, thereby retracting support for the slave system. Individual resistance to the slavery mind virus decreases the collective level of tolerance to it. True freedom is the default condition. Before any immorality was created and persisted, there was no slavery as a permanent condition of life. Freedom is the default starting point. Zero immorality equals true freedom, the natural state or condition. Violations of rights are attempts to claim ownership upon the property of others, and by extension, claims of ownership upon others, which is slavery. If more immorality persists, we get more slavery, less freedoms. If less immorality persists, we get less slavery, more freedoms. In a condition of persistent slavery, not doing any immoral behavior is the moral behavior that brings things back to the balance of 0. Teaching morality is the higher moral behavior required to end immorality. When the majority voluntarily lives in full morality, absolute morality, violators are dealt with by the courage of applying consequences, by enacting the defense principle or the self-defense principle. When you have that courage, that means you're in full morality. If all you have are people doing M1, which is not initiating harm, and they don't apply self-defense, they're not doing M2, that higher morality, well, they're not applying consequences when immorality does happen. So then they're only doing one out of the 2 parts of what it is to be truly moral, to be a truly good person. Not teaching morality results in the absence of full morality, which allows the immoral foothold to stay and grow. So similarly, not just the self-defense principle, you have to do the great work, teaching morality. And if you don't do that other aspect of M2, self-defense principle is one aspect of M2, doing the great work, teaching objective morality is the other aspect of higher morality, morality level 2. And that means there's the absence of full morality. So only when you don't initiate harm, M1, and you do the two aspects of M2, that you're teaching morality and you're ready to apply the self-defense principle, and you apply it when it gets violated, and people are in moral unison, that's full morality. And the absence of that, because you're not teaching it, well, that allows immorality for evil to persist, and it doesn't put an end to evil. So that's the end of part 3. Thank you for your time and attention. You can check out parts 1 and 2 on my site. It's on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. I think I'm adding it to BitChute as well. And part 4 will be coming. I have to do more work on those, so they won't be as quickly as the part 1, 2, and 3 have come out, but they will come in the future. And I will be dealing with justice, chaos and order, getting into that more deeply, and karma, as I previously mentioned. So thank you for your time and attention. Take care. Peace.